Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 2021 SPPGA Policy Salon, Shaping the Post-COVID World. My name is Veena Sriram, and I'm your MC for this webinar. I'm an assistant professor in global health policy here at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the School of Population and Public Health here at the University of British Columbia. Welcome everyone to our event today. For those of you in the Vancouver area, hope you're staying warm and dry. It is really wet and cold out there, so hope you're indoors right now. So before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited settler on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples, where the UBC Vancouver campus is located. And I offer immense gratitude and thanks to the nation and to the Musqueam peoples who have been the protectors of these lands and waters for millennia. And today, Musqueam Elder Larry Grant, who's the elder in residence at UBC's First Nations House of Learning, couldn't be with us, but he kindly recorded a traditional welcome and gave some remarks, which we will now play. As we take a moment to start this video, I'd like to invite you to reflect upon the Indigenous lands that you are on today. And a good online resource to do this is Native Land at native-land.ca. And our colleagues will be posting a link to this in the chat.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here to see you all online. And I want to say thank you to the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs for having me here to do the land acknowledgement of this Policy Salon for 2021 here at the UBC campus at Vancouver on the Musqueam traditional and ancestral unceded lands. See it all at to swallow for economic for ETE at UBC to need to tamuchet for Musqueam. Locks the Shuanas Kipalanoch, Equaltimiltoch, because he looks to Winas naming netten, because for ETE. That's all tamuchet for the Equanas Shuanas Kipalanoch, Setis and need to swallow. He looks to Mukalop, because Cleos for ETE to Nawale. Anonymous to Muktemo, because the site to Squalowans, because you allow to see Squawky, because the site to Mukwet, I Chapewa, Siam, Nasiaya. See yourself. I want to say thank you again for having me here this morning to do the land acknowledgement. My name's Larry Grant. Sayaslak is my Musqueam name, and I come from the Musqueam people who have been on this land for millennia. I am a descendant of Kipalanoch, the warrior that was here to greet the first ships to arrive under the Spanish Narvaez and the English under Captain George Vancouver. And as our ancestors did in the past, I do today and raise my hands and welcome to all of you here at UBC on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands. The lands that have never been surrendered, the lands that have never been given up, and the lands that have never been sold, and also the lands that have no agreement of occupation and for no benefit to the indigenous peoples that have lived here for millennia. And it's something that I believe that in a global situation, this has to be very clear that the lands that the University of British Columbia sits upon are lands that are not surrendered nor sold, nor of any benefit to the people of this land. So that's an important thing to think about, because this is post First pandemic that happened here prior to Narvaez and Vancouver and Captain Cook arriving on our shores. The smallpox epidemic traveled either up the coast or across the trade routes across North America to devastate our communities and making it appear that the villages were abandoned. And this is important today because we're speaking about and concentrating on public health policies post-pandemic 19 in 2021. And this is important to understand that the Indigenous peoples have suffered through several pandemics and then were moved into a colonial state and being subjugated and assimilated. And this is a post-Indigenous pandemics that happened prior to colonization. So there is huge post-traumatic stress disorder that's created by the pandemic, but also by the colonialization and assimilation of the Canadian government and the Indigenous peoples. And we have to look at that when we're talking about post-COVID-19 2021, the post-traumatic stress disorder, that the trauma that has been created by the COVID lockdowns and isolations and the denial of socioeconomic inclusion is something that we have to deal with on a public and a global scale that will affect the way that we can create policies that can move us forward in post-pandemic 2021. So those are the few little words that I would like to say that's regarding the how policies can be improved and made better for the post-pandemic world that we're going to be experiencing shortly. So hi TPOSCM, collect Constitutala, Teswala, Hui Namat, Hui Tanawaya, hi TPOSCM, hi TPO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elder Grant, for those really insightful remarks and for continuing to support the learning of our SPPGA community. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Ramana for welcome remarks on behalf of SPPGA. Ramana is the acting director of our school, as our director, Alison McFarlane, could not be with us today. Professor Ramana is a faculty member here at SPPGA and is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security. He's also the director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues. Over to you, Ramana.
Thank you, Ina. Welcome everyone to our event, Shaping the Post-COVID World, as part of the 2021 Policy Salon. And thank you again for the introduction, Ina. It's my pleasure to provide some brief remarks on behalf of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, known as SPPGA. Our school consists of 26 faculty members who are actively engaged in local and global issues such as climate change, Asia-Pacific policy, Indigenous rights, energy policy, democracy, public health, and resource governance. I'm particularly thrilled to welcome my colleague Heidi Tuareg and our panelists today to speak to the twin global crisis of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, and what policy lessons we can learn from each. These are just the types of issues we address through research, collaboration, and policy engagement at SPPGA. Despite the wet and cold weather outside, I warmly welcome everyone in attendance today and in particular, the 100+ students in our Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs program who are learning to analyze local and global policy issues from different perspectives and test solutions in the classroom and beyond. I also want to welcome our MPPGA alumni and my faculty colleagues in attendance. We look forward to your questions. This event is the first of many to come throughout the academic year. We look forward to having the UBC community and interested members of the public join us at future virtual and eventually our in-person events on the Vancouver campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. Back to you, Veena. Have a good event, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Ramana. So today's Policy Salon, Shaping the Post-COVID World, addresses the twin crises that we're now facing globally: pandemic preparedness, including our ongoing struggles with COVID-19, and climate action. And to summarize a quote from the global health scholar Shea Abimbola, the heart of the response to both of these crises is the need for global solidarity and a recognition of our interlinked fates to one another and between human health and planetary health. So in this session, we seek to explore key learnings from these crises and understand how these lessons can help us strengthen and accelerate global efforts to address them going forward. And we are very delighted to welcome an outstanding lineup of panelists here who are going to help us unpack these thorny issues. This panel uniquely brings together experts from both domains, from global health and from climate action. And this allows us to draw on their expertise to think about how lessons can be applied across these issues going forward. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists to you. First up is Dr. Kelly Lee, who's a professor and Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Professor Lee's research focuses on the impacts of globalization on population health and the ways that collective action and global governance can mitigate these impacts. Her current research involves leading the Pandemics and Borders Project, which focuses on the use of cross-border measures, for example, travel and trade during COVID-19, and the implications for global responses governed by the WHO. We're very grateful to have you with us today, Dr. Lee, and we also wanted to mention that SPPGA's former graduate program manager, Julianne Piper, is a research fellow with the Borders Project and works closely with Dr. Lee and is here with us. So welcome as well, Julianne. Next up is Dr. David Boyd, who's an associate professor with SPPGA and with the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability at UBC. He holds the distinguished role as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. David is one of Canada's leading experts in environmental law and policy and is an internationally renowned authority on the relationship between human health and environmental degradation. Thanks so much, David, for joining us today. And next up is Dr. Sandeep Pai, who's a senior research lead in the Energy Security and Climate Change program with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His professional and academic work has allowed him to study the energy sector, rural development, and climate change very closely in emerging economies such as India, Kenya, and South Africa. He earned his PhD right here in UBC with the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. So welcome back to UBC, Sandeep. And last but not least, our fearless moderator today is Associate Professor Heidi Tworik, who's a faculty member with SPPGA and History, again here at UBC. She's an award-winning researcher of media, history, health communications, international organizations, and platform governance. Her research brings a historical sensibility to policy discussions, particularly around communications and international organizations. That's our panel, and over to you, Heidi.
Thank you so much, Veena. Thank you, Ramana, and thank you to Elder Grant for the introductions. I mean, it's really a treat for me to be the moderator of this panel. I could certainly grill these three people for hours and hours, but I want to make sure that you, the audience, remember that you should be putting your questions. Please do type them into the Q&A. I will do my best to ensure that as many of them get answered in the next 60 to 70 minutes as possible. So I would say that the first time that it became obviously clear to me, if it wasn't clear to everyone, that these two crises are intertwined was a moment last summer when there were terrible wildfire smoke sprawled around Vancouver and also Burnaby, where Dr. Lee is located. And the chief medical officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry, had a surreal moment in a press conference where she basically said, you can't really go outside because the air is so awful, but you also can't gather inside because of COVID. And that seemed to me just a very simple encapsulation of how thinking these two things together was the way that we actually have to be living our lives right here in this place. So having mentioned something apocalyptic, I am going to start with an opening question to our panel that tries to start focusing on the other aspect of what we do at SPPGA that Ramana brought up, which is thinking about solutions and thinking about potential positive examples. So I think we're definitely going to delve in this panel into all the things that have gone wrong, but I hope we can begin. The opening question is to try to think of some ways that we move forward as well. So the opening question for our panelists to just kick things off is, when you think about either climate change or COVID, do you see examples of jurisdictions that are handling these crises well? What explains their performance, and what can we learn from that for other places? So we'll start off with Dr. Lee.
Thanks, Heidi, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's great to try and connect some dots because these things are interconnected. So I'll answer this question by focusing on the COVID pandemic. And I wanted to clarify that by handling this crisis well, we're going to focus on one criteria, which is limiting the number of total infections and deaths from this virus, SARS-CoV-2, per capita or per million population. And I say this up front because we could use a lot of criteria to assess performance. We could use hospitalization bed, ICU beds filled, vaccination rates, broader societal impacts, loss of income, and so on. So I'm going to focus on this hard data, but just to recognize that there are lots of ways we can measure success. So just using the criteria of infections and deaths, we can see right at the top of the list in high performers would be small island states, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Samoa, and so on. And then it's followed by, it's quite a mixture of high, middle, and low-income countries. So we can throw in there countries like Tanzania, Laos, China, Bhutan, New Zealand, and Australia we often hear about, but also Burundi, Burkina Faso, and Singapore. So there's quite a mixture. There doesn't seem to be much of a pattern there. And so identifying which jurisdictions with the fewest infections and deaths is actually the easy part. The second part of your question, what explains their performance, is a little harder to understand because there's such a mixture. And I think there's a multiple range of factors. One of them is clearly geography. So during the pandemic, if you happen to be a small island country that you can sort of, tuck yourself away from the rest of the world, that was clearly an advantage. And you can, kind of reduce imports of infection that way. Larger island countries like Taiwan and Cyprus, for example, have a kind of similar advantage. Geography matters. Demographics also matter. Countries with aging populations, especially where these populations suffer from what were described as pre-existing conditions, had a higher rate of illness and death from COVID-19. So then those are factors that you can't do anything about once a pandemic occurs in some ways. So beyond geography and demographics, things get a little more interesting. So then what's striking about the countries that are ranked, I guess, near the bottom rather than the top are countries, I guess, that would have been described as most pandemic prepared before this pandemic hit. So it's a little surprising, to be honest. There's a lot of head scratching about why these countries like the UK and the US were considered the highest prepared, but they somehow have, performed quite poorly. And it's clear that those pandemic preparedness plans planned for the wrong event. They planned for influenza. They planned for the wrong types of things. So we need to really learn from that. And it also tells us that you don't necessarily have to have a lot of resources to perform well during this pandemic. So a lot of countries have who have listed tend to be low and middle income countries, have used other methods that aren't just costing a lot of money. And I think also what it tells us that early warning systems by Western countries in particular are useful, but it's what happens afterwards. Once you're told, there's a pandemic on its way, how do you mobilize society? And it's the countries that have really been able to do that have performed well. And I think the word solidarity was used, global solidarity. This seems to be a really key factor. So we can talk about this a bit more later on. And I guess finally, the further point I would make is that jurisdictions that performed well have varied over time. So, depending on what point in the pandemic you're talking about, no jurisdiction has done everything right throughout this whole long pandemic. So you have ups and downs, you have continual adaptation. So jurisdictions that have adapted have followed the evolving science and have learned from their mistakes are those that tend to do well. Those who are anti-science or tend to stick to a rigid plan, they don't tend to do so well because this virus is evolving. And I think the responses to them also have to evolve. And also, of course, the vaccination aspect. So once vaccines come online, you also again have to adapt your strategy. So overall, there's a multiple number of factors that can explain why some jurisdictions have done better than others. It's a combination of geography, demographics, and I think society, how socially equitable your society is, how much solidarity there is. I'll leave it at that because I have 5 minutes and I want to overstay my welcome there. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you. That's incredibly important. I think especially some of these points that actually the things that were measured as the ways that we would think about understanding if somewhere is in fact prepared often relied on things like resources. And your point that resources aren't necessarily the determining factor is, I think, something very useful for us to think about when we think about a question of climate change. So with that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Sandeep Pai and ask you exactly the same question, but thinking more about climate change. So do we see places that are handling this well? What explains it? And what can we learn from that?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. It's really amazing to come back to UBC and talk about this topic. I mean, before I get into climate change, I do want to spend 1 minute because I was thinking a bit about like the parallels between COVID and climate change. And so I look at Bloomberg's resiliency ranking of sort of handling of the crisis in terms of least social and economic disruption. And they rank 53 countries. And you always, and I monitor that over time. And I see that, like, let's say in August, you have the top 10 countries are the rich countries, right? Like you have the Norways, of the Swedens, and different countries. And the bottom 10 are always large emerging economies, Malaysia, India, and so on and so forth. Now zoom back and one of the things that always explains this is, lack of institutional capacity, because this is a broader ranking looking at 12 different indicators, things like, vaccination rates, hospitalization, et cetera, and also handling of like social disruption. And then you have the bottom 10, which are like the large emerging economies. You have the top 10 best ones, which are like the European sort of like the powers which have sort of like more resources, institutional capacity. Now, when you think about the climate crisis, the most vulnerable countries are also these emerging economies, large emerging economies. I mean, small also, but also really large. And the best countries that can cope up from the vulnerabilities of climate change are also these rich countries. So one of the things that I think that explains why this is this whole institutional mechanism to deal with crisis. You have governance structures that can respond to these large-scale crises. I mean, for example, India, where I come from, there's no hospitals or lack of hospitals, which really aggravated this already terrible situation. When you draw parallel to climate change, when you have slow onset events such as droughts or immediate events such as fires, like the institutions are not geared towards addressing some of these immediate challenges. So I think one of the big lessons for that I have learned from both crises is that we need to build really strong local and national level institutions to deal with these very global crisis. I will stop there and pass it on to David.
Thank you, David. On to you. And I'll just say one thing before you do, which is, I was just thinking as you talked about the resiliency index, I mean, I wonder, are we going to be surprised, just like we were with COVID, that actually these indices, maybe they're measuring the wrong thing. And suddenly it turns out that some low and middle income countries in COVID had a very different type of institutional capacity or solidarity. So to me, that's something immediately in this panel, in the first 10 minutes, there's a new thing for me to think about by bringing these two together. So David, last but not least, same question to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Heidi. And it's great to be on this panel. I'm joining you today from Sideas, Pender Island, in the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish First Nations. You know, in your introductory remarks, Heidi, and Ramona said this as well, talking about these twin crises. And I would actually say these twin crises have a bunch of siblings. And I think, you know, before I get to the positive part, I want to say, look, we also live in a world where 800 million people go to bed hungry every day, suffering from malnutrition, where 1 billion people don't have access to safe drinking water, billions more don't have access to adequate sanitation, where air pollution is killing 7 million people every year. And where biodiversity is in a downward spiral. So I think, and then those are all examples from my field. And then if we broaden it out, you know, we're also in a world where I think inequality and extreme poverty have to be included at the very top of our agenda. And the good news is that we actually have a global vision for addressing all of these problems, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. And it breaks my heart that we don't talk about that vision and how to achieve that vision every day, about what we can do to get there. And I do think there are some compelling examples of success. You know, the world's leading scientists are telling us we need rapid, systemic, and transformative changes. Incremental policy changes are not going to get us from where we are to where we need to be. So if we look at inspiring examples of transformative changes, I mean, look at the example of Costa Rica, you know, a small Latin American country where in 1948, they decided to abolish the military and invest in healthcare and education. And at the time, the average life expectancy in Costa Rica was about 20 years shorter than the United States. A few decades later, the average life expectancy in Costa Rica is longer than the average life expectancy in the United States. They have a tremendously educated population, which has enabled them to shift from a predominantly agricultural economy to an economy where their leading exports are silicon chips and medical prosthetic devices. I mean, it's an incredible story. They have invested in a public healthcare system, which was profiled in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago, which should be the envy of most countries in the world. And on the environmental front, Costa Rica is a country where they recognized that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment back in 1993 in their constitution. And that has been a driver for transformative changes. They, at that time, deforestation had reduced forest cover in Costa Rica to about 25% of the land. Over the past 30 years, they have totally turned that around, and they're now at over 50% of their land is in forest cover, partly through a really innovative program where they took revenue from a carbon tax to address climate change and used that carbon tax revenue to pay indigenous people and campesinos to reforest and restore their lands. Costa Rica gets 99% of its electricity from renewable energy sources. They have prohibited open pit mining. And right now, you know, their president last year announced that they're very proud of the transformation that was engendered by the termination of the military in the late 1940s. And they feel like they're now on the cusp of another transformation, which is the decarbonization of their society. And so they're debating a bill right now in Costa Rica to permanently prohibit any oil and gas development. I mean, that's the kind of transformative policies that we need to address the climate crisis. But what Costa Rica shows us is A, you don't have to be rich, and B, you can address these problems in an integrated manner. So I just think that's a very inspiring example of how we can address these challenges in a successful way that addresses economic, social, human rights, and environmental sustainability.
Thank you, David. That is indeed very inspiring. I have to say, most of what I knew about Costa Rica was how it had transformed itself into a place for ecotourism. So it's fascinating to learn more about this. And I think an example of how taking a global lens reminds us that many of the best examples are not coming from the places that we might expect. So I'm going to keep asking the panel some questions, and please do put yours, pop them into the Q&A, not into the chat, just to remind you. So I wanted to talk about something that I think Elder Grant also brought up in his remarks that I think is really crucial, and David also alluded to this, is this question of equity and equality. So while both COVID and climate are obviously global issues, we've all seen how the effects have differed quite dramatically, whether that is low-income and minority and marginalized populations in high-income settings, or populations in low and middle income countries being left behind and suffering disproportionately. In some cases, that suffering only becoming visible when civil society and other groups even start to collect the statistics to show that in the first place, as has happened, even in some parts of Canada, that these things were simply not visible until certain groups started to collect those statistics. So I'm wondering, how did we get to this point? And what can we do moving forward to ensure a more equitable future, to ensure a more equitable response to these kinds of crises? So I'm going to leave it open for whoever would like to jump in first.
Happy to jump in. Heidi? Yeah. Okay, so clearly equity, or I guess inequity, has been a defining feature of this pandemic. We've seen it all around us, and social solidarity, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the key features of jurisdictions that have fared better. And it's being closely linked to social inequities, having the performance of different jurisdictions. So the more inequitable your society, the more unlikely it is to pull together during an emergency. And so what we see in Canada, and I guess elsewhere, is pre-existing social fissures have opened up into really large cracks during this pandemic. And then gaping wounds, you might say, fed more division, erosion of trust in government and science, and so on. So you get these battles going on in societies where there wasn't equity in the first place. So how did we get to this point? Well, I would very much, go back to my international political economy training. In the late 20th century, we unleashed markets to drive wealth creation, wealth generation through economic globalization. And we allowed capital to chase cheap labor, cheap natural resources, low regulation of that capital. And we did not ensure redistribution of wealth. We were all told, right, all the boats would rise in the harbor and there'd be trickle-down effects, and that, inequality is going to be still there, but we're going to have a bigger pie to feast from. And none of this has actually proven true. Instead, what we find ourselves in is a situation with the highest rate of inequality for decades, if not centuries. So we're in a very a precarious time, and then along comes the pandemic, and that's actually the very bad timing. So we didn't rein in the markets even when we had the economic crisis in 2008. So we just basically papered over the cracks and kept things going. And Thomas Piketty's book, of course, is the eloquent discussion of all of this. So I think in this context, what we're seeing is inequitable impacts of the pandemic and climate change because of these pre-existing lack of redistribution of wealth and fairness in the world. And so we're seeing this play out, of course, with the vaccine issue. And that's something probably that is on everyone's minds, trying to get people vaccinated in your own country. But we have to remind ourselves that we are not out of this until the rest of the world is vaccinated. And we're, I think, in Canada doing an appalling job sharing what we have and enabling the rest of the world to have access to these life-saving vaccines. And we should hang our heads in shame, I think, at the fact that our government hasn't done more to do what is right, as well as what is in our interests. So unfortunately, that's the situation we face now.
And before I move to Sandeep and David, maybe Kelly, for those who are new to Canada and don't know as much about Canada's policies on vaccines, maybe you could just do a minute and fill people in on what the Canadian government's approach to this has been, because some of the SPPGA students are international and new to Canada and might not know as much about that.
Sure. So like a lot of countries, the high-income countries, Canada pre-ordered many doses of vaccine. In fact, I think it was at one point 9 times what each of us needed, just in case, because we didn't know which vaccines were going to work and whether we needed to have boosters and so on. And of course, we haven't had all these delivered, but we're doing very well. We're, I think, one of the leading countries in terms of vaccination rates in this country. I think we're up to about 75% of the population has at least 1 dose. So we're well on the way. But unfortunately, what we do need is to have the Canadian government share some of those doses with COVAX, the global initiative to share vaccines worldwide, especially in low and middle income countries, but also to stop, I guess, preventing other manufacturers around the world from manufacturing these, to waive the kind of intellectual property rights protections of these vaccines. And that has been, I don't understand why, well, I do understand in some ways it is the, protecting wealth and protecting the concentration of wealth, but nobody wins, not even the wealthy, if we don't get these vaccines out faster because of variants, because the more transmission of the virus, the more variants appear. And we might have to start this all over again. And we could be here sitting in a year's time or 2 years' time talking about the same thing. So this is the problem. So Canada, and I believe many European countries have been blocking this waiver at the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And putting my historian hat on, because now I'm going to turn to Sandeep and David and say, how did we get to this point? At least with the IP, that goes back to the 1880s. And the creation in terms of copyright, it begins with the creation of the Berne Convention, but also other conventions around trademark and intellectual property. And even in the 1880s, when Haiti was, a country that was in fact independent, I've read the documents where Haiti and Haitian delegates go to a convention trying to create the Berne Convention. They say, can we please lift some of the copyright on scientific literature so that we can have access to it? And the British and the French say, no, sorry, not going to happen. So actually, these are things embedded since the late 19th century in some cases that we see, obviously, iteration in new form in the WTO and so on. So, the historian always says things happened long ago and are more complicated. But in this case, some of the regimes we're talking about, they're created in a world where Haiti is one of the few colonized countries to be independent. We see ways in which it's blocked from accessing scientific knowledge. So David and Sandeep, then the same question to you about equity. How did we get here, this inequitable world that David sketched? And what do we do to ensure a more equitable future? David, we'll go to you first and then Sandeep.
Thanks, Heidi. Well, first of all, I just echo everything that Professor Lee has already said about political economy. And I think that we're talking to a policy audience. Policy makes an absolutely immense difference when we talk about equity. Consider two oil-producing nations, Norway and Equatorial Guinea. Norway is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Equatorial Guinea on a per capita basis, the highest GDP in Africa, and yet absolutely polar opposites when it comes to societal equity and inequality. Norway has used policies, strong public policies, to ensure not a perfectly equal distribution of wealth, but to ensure that there is equality within the Norwegian society. Equatorial Guinea, by contrast, despite having the highest per capita GDP in Africa, has the worst level of income inequality on earth. And that is absolutely because of different public policies between those two nations. So my pitch here is to really say, if we took a human rights-based approach to all of these issues, if we recognize people's basic human rights, then we would be much further ahead. And so governments have to stop treating human rights as options that they may fulfill and treat them as the obligations that they are intended to be in international law, in domestic constitutional law. Because if we look at countries, certainly in the climate context, countries that are taking a rights-based approach to climate change, whether it's Fiji, the Marshall Islands, Uruguay, Sweden, these countries are really at the forefront in addressing climate change, both domestically and on the global stage. So a rights-based approach is a very powerful tool, not only to addressing the climate crisis, but addressing to these interlocking crises that we've been talking about this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, David. And then over to you, Sandeep, before we're going to bring up a couple of students to ask some questions as well. So,
yeah, thank you. I think both Dr. David Boyd and Dr. Kelly's points are amazing, but I'm going to be a little bit more outlier here. I personally don't think inequality is per se a bad thing. Rather, I would say that like everybody should have a basic level, and then beyond that, some people will always have more and some will always have less. But the big challenge for me is that like millions and billions don't have even the basics, and others have too much more. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that, like, the idea for me is to really lift people who are at the bottom to a certain level, and then obviously there will be some people who are more, and so my energy would be focused on how to lift people who are already in the bottom to a certain level. Now, one of the things when I think about the climate crisis, right, like we know historically who has emitted, who has sort of, the rich world has been responsible for the climate crisis, although now China, India, and others are adding multiple things. But we had the UNFCCC and the process and the Green Climate Fund, where some of these countries had to contribute towards that equity, their fair share of climate finance, which other countries can use and grow and raise their citizens to a basic level before, at the same time also take climate action. But the challenge is that some of those funds and others are not even reaching those nations. You had the $100 billion fund every year. Out of that, only $80 billion have reached. Out of that, like 60% of those funds are loans rather than grants. And so this means that people who are at the bottom, like we are talking about a massive inequality, and I'm trying to lift some above at this level, at the same time, trying to address this crisis. So if these commitments are not met, I think this inequality will become bigger, and people who are suffering will not even be able to reach the basic levels that are required to actually take some of these bold climate action. You have to lift people who do not have basic access to electricity. You cannot, for many of these countries, mitigation alone cannot be the only goal. Like you have to also club development along with mitigation. So the point I'm trying to say is that if we have to address some of these crises, I think it's paramount that billions are lifted out of those energy and basic developmental needs.
Yeah, thank you. And it's another place where, for me, the two crises intersect, right? Because we've seen ways in which the inequality that Kelly is describing going back decades has been exacerbated and accelerated by the pandemic rather than mitigated by it. So we have, to make sure we have student voices, we have a couple of students with us who are going to ask questions. So first I'm going to call on Lindsay Wall to unmute and ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on. I apologize if my internet is a little laggy. The question I had hoped to ask was that, so in global climate policy, action tends to lean on non-binding commitments and incentives-based strategies, whereas with COVID, I'm starting to see greater occurrences of mandatory actions. So in some jurisdictions, there were lockdowns or mask mandates, or now we're seeing the vaccine passports. And I'm wondering if you could discuss the pros and cons of each strategy, or if you think COVID is sort of opening the door to more mandatory action on climate. Thanks.
David, go for it. Lindsay, that's a fabulous question. David, please.
That is a great question. And I want to be absolutely crystal clear in my answer. Voluntary solutions don't work. We've seen that for over 30 years in the climate space. We've seen that for decades in terms of the attempts to reduce global inequality. And we know that mandatory approaches, while they may be in some cases unpopular, they work. So yeah, if we look at climate change, for example, in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change comes into force. Countries of the world commit to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system. 30 years later, greenhouse gas emissions globally are up 60%, a complete global policy failure. But here's my pitch for human rights again. The problem with these international environmental laws, including the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biodiversity, there is absolutely no compliance or enforcement mechanism. There is no teeth to these agreements. But when you integrate international human rights law with international environmental law, you get mechanisms, institutions, processes that can hold governments accountable. And this is one of the most exciting positive developments of the last 2 or 3 years, is we've seen in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Colombia, courts saying that international environmental law has to inform the human rights obligations of states. And so these courts are empowered to take unprecedented steps to require governments to take more ambitious climate action. In the Netherlands, to immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions within a year, which required the government of the Netherlands to close down a coal-fired power plant that had just recently been built, to take all kinds of other steps to promote renewable energy. In Germany, a court decision earlier this year in a case brought by young people based on their rights, which led to the German Constitutional Court striking down part of Germany's climate legislation, and the government responding within a matter of weeks by increasing their ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 65% by 2030 and bringing forward the target for their net zero commitments. In Colombia, the Supreme Court of Colombia, again in a case brought by children and youth based on their human rights, ordered the government of Colombia to take steps to end deforestation in the Colombian portion of the Amazon. So by getting the synergy of human rights law and environmental law, we can actually make progress, but it does require mandatory action to address climate change.
Sandeep, I see you nodding, so I'm going to ask if you have anything to add before we go to Kelly to see what she thinks from the COVID perspective.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think if some of these measures are not mandatory, part of the reason is also sort of, you have in democracies, you have political parties that come and go. And if some of these measures are voluntary, then what we saw what happened in US, right, in the last 5 years, and during the President Trump era, and so I think if some of these climate measures are not mandatory, even at a global scale, which I admit is hard because you have to get these 200 countries to agree on something, and everybody has motivations and their own motivations. But I think if some of these are not mandatory, not legally binding, I think there is always this fear that the next government will come, next institution will come, and then they will either dilute it or completely window dress it in such a way that real action doesn't happen. So I fully agree with David, and I echo his point that I think mandatory measures are the need of the hour, given the kind of crisis we are in.
Yeah, Kelly, over to you, because of course this is one of the big fights is over what should be mandatory, what shouldn't, and just your perspective on that would be really valuable.
Yeah, oh boy, yeah. Who would have predicted the amount of contestation around just wearing a face mask to keep each other safe, or getting a vaccine? Who never predicted this. So I guess I go back to this difference between countries that have done well during this pandemic and those who haven't. There's some research to show that societies that give primacy to individualism, my rights, what I do and is sacrosanct and so on, tend not to do as well as those societies where cultures tend to go for a collective approach. And I'm not talking North Korea. I think I've had emails where people say, you're advocating for this, you're trying to create China or North Korea in Canada, and we're not like that. This kind of authoritarian state. And what we're talking about really is about collective or community interests. So we all have rights. We also have responsibilities as part of a society. And so the mandatory use of vaccination, these so-called passports, the use of masking is about keeping collective, keeping us all safe. And so, yeah, for me, nothing really changes without some mandatory aspect. The end of slavery didn't happen because people just voluntarily gave up their slaves. We didn't stop smoking in public places because somebody told us not to do that. Laws came into effect. Laws lead social change, and for the the greater good. And I think that in this case, yeah, I'm very supportive of these measures that have had to be taken.
Yeah, thank you. All right, our second student, Inequality.
Thank you very much, appreciate it. And thanks to you all. It's been a fantastic thing to listen to, I appreciate it. I wanted to ask more about the pervasiveness of this idea of inequality and what you're talking about, because it is, from what I've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, a link or an idea that is more recent. And in the public mind, I think that acting on climate change is still most often seen as a problem of reducing GHG emissions. And if you ask someone on the street, like generally they tell, yeah, like if we reduce all GHG emissions, we're good. But inequality at the same time becomes, just something for now. Inequality is still something that's related to climate justice and to a framework that is still seen as more radical. And I'm wondering, considering that it is so important, what are, according to you, the key institutions that need to be reformed and the key practices that need to be implemented in order for this goal of reducing inequality to be put at the center of the political agenda in the fight for climate change?
Thank you. So that would be either Sandeep or David who wants to go first on that one, I think.
Sandeep, do you want to take a crack at it?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think I will go back to what I said, and maybe it's a bit controversial, that I personally don't think inequality can be solved. And I'm trying to be a bit realistic. But what I'm trying to say is that because of the huge gap in inequality, my focus is to lift those who are at the bottom to a certain level. So for me personally, it's okay if there's some rich people, but I don't want poor people to be extremely poor. So that is the framework that I come from, because I do believe that like there's billions who lack basics, right? And so I think my goal is, rather than demolish the rich, which will contribute to helping the poor, my goal is to create institutions and structures and mechanisms in which you actually provide electricity access to millions of people who do not have access to electricity. People who use, almost half of humanity uses biomass for cooking, right? Like, so I think that is the scale. And then you have people who have like 5 gas stoves and different things. So my focus right now is to provide sort of like the basics to some of these peoples. And in that process, perhaps you have to demolish that larger inequality, but the focus has to be to lift them. And to bring back one of the comments about your question is that I think climate justice is climate action in some ways or the other. Like if you think about it at a global scale, right? We are really talking about equity, right? Like between rich nations and poor nations, between rich and poor within emerging economies and so on and so forth. So that justice, where you don't leave anybody behind as you take bold climate action, is at the heart of how we take steps and actually get public to support climate action.
David, do you want to add anything else before we start whipping through all the questions being asked?
Yeah, no, definitely. I was really glad to hear Sandeep talk about leaving no one behind. That's one of the key messages or one of the key aspirations of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But what we have to see is we have to see a much greater willingness on behalf of the wealthy to transfer wealth to the global south. Because as Professor Lee was talking about earlier, the notion that we can just keep making the pie bigger on a finite planet, we're already running up against planetary boundaries with the existing human global economy, which is closing in on $100 trillion a year. And yet the wealthy countries who are, there's such a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor in this world, and yet the wealthy are just hoarding that wealth and becoming increasingly wealthy. It's absolutely, to me, morally unconscionable that we have so many billionaires in this world, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who have over $100 billion in net worth. I mean, that should be seen as just a gross ethical violation of human norms. And so I'll give you one example. When countries of the world started talking about in 1992 about climate action and came together to agree to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was three main categories of action. One was mitigation, one was adaptation, and one was something called addressing loss and damage. So in terms of mitigation and adaptation, as Sandeep mentioned earlier, wealthy countries committed in Paris to mobilize $100 billion a year in climate finance. They haven't met that commitment. Only a small portion of that commitment has gone to the small island developing states and the world's least developed countries. And as Sandeep said, a lot of that is in the forms of loans. So that's just making it harder for those poor countries to actually get out of the hole that they're already in. So first of all, we need to dramatically jack up climate finance for mitigation and adaptation, and for exporting technologies that will allow people in the global south to actually have access to electricity. I mean, you know, it's unbelievable that there's still more than 1 billion people who don't have access to any electricity whatsoever, right? And then this idea of loss and damage that was first discussed over 30 years ago, that is in recognition of the fact that there are existing climate impacts that cannot be mitigated, that cannot be adapted to. So, you know, for example, there's a Caribbean nation called Dominica that's been hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes in the last 6 years. It's a tiny island state. How are they? Over 90% of their buildings have been damaged in each of those hurricanes. How do they pay for the reconstruction? So the idea of loss and damage was that would be money that would go from the rich countries to the poor countries for this very purpose. And do you know how many dollars have changed hands in 30 years? A big fat zero, because rich countries have just stalled and stalled and stalled. And so these small island developing states are putting forward what I think are incredibly compelling proposals, like an international air passenger levy, which could be, you know, between $10 and $40 per flight. That's not going to stop anybody from flying. It's not going to harm any wealthy person. But over all of the flights taken in the world, that's going to generate tens of billions of dollars every year for adaptation and for reconstruction in these poor countries. Similarly, the Marshall Islands this year proposed an international levy on shipping. Again, who does shipping disproportionately benefit? Rich people who are getting, you know, all their goods coming across the Pacific from China. And so those are the kinds of actions that we need to stop talking about and start doing to generate literally tens and hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be redistributed from the north to the south. Because I can tell you right now that you know, the existing commitments that are being made, like I was just reading the communique of the G7 from their meeting earlier this year in the UK, where they announced in glowing terms that they had committed hundreds of millions of dollars in new climate finance. And I read that and thought, that is total crap. Hundreds of millions of dollars. We're at a global crisis. We need to be talking about trillions of dollars. And so, you know, we as citizens, we as policymakers, we need to call them out on those kinds of just misinformation things. And we need to say in very clear and compelling terms, these global crises require investments of trillions of dollars to address them, and they require redistribution of income also on the scale of trillions of dollars.
So thank you so much, Nicolas. So the next question is going to go right to the heart, I think, of that that you just mentioned, David. So Michael Small asks, given the stubborn resistance to COVID vaccines and masking by a significant percentage of the population in developed countries, despite the immediate and evident threat to personal health posed by COVID, what should we infer then from those experiences about our ability to secure public support for measures to reduce our carbon footprint? When in this case, and maybe I'll rephrase a bit, so to deal with what to many seems like a long-term diffuse threat like climate change. So I don't know, Kelly, if you want to say anything about the resistance to COVID vaccines and masking, and then maybe David and Sandeep can say what they might have drawn from this for how we derive public support or mitigate public resistance to climate change measures. So Kelly.
Thanks, Heidi. I won't say much, but you know, I said earlier about culture, but I also think it's a reflection of trust and maybe a loss of public trust in government, in large, you know, our Western democratic government, a loss of trust in big business. And I think there's this, you know, a sense that those two are in some sort of unholy partnership. And, you know, people, you know, believe that this is what's at the heart of COVID, and there's all sorts of course theories around conspiracy theories. So there's that. There's a lot of different reasons why people are being resistant to various public health protocols, whether it's a lack of understanding of the science, whether it's, you know, a kind of defense of their personal liberties, or just plain bloody mindedness, to be honest. You know, you know, it's a variety of things. But I would say that to overcome that, there's this, what they're calling an infodemic. You know, there's something we haven't had to deal with in public health before, where there's so much mis and disinformation which is being circulated that's really worsening things. If you look at pictures from the 1918-19 pandemic, people were wearing masks. There wasn't any protests against wearing masks. You know, people knew that this was helpful. Today we have, of course, social media and all sorts of chatter on there. So this is something we've had to deal with, I think, in public health that we never had before. We used to be the good guys, right? Now we're kind of like the bad guys in many people's eyes, and that's new to us. So I think, again, reinforcing maybe that trust again, and showing that people's interests are at heart, and, you know, just keep explaining to people that this is not, no one's benefiting from making these masks, no one's benefiting from the vaccines other than everybody is in the collective sense. And hopefully that message will eventually get through.
Yeah, thank you. So David and Sandeep, I wonder if you think, even think about how we, you know, I say this is a person who works in communications, how do we disaggregate what the public is and who still needs to be brought on board, and how, so that we can mobilize in the ways that David was describing?
Yeah, I think it actually goes deeper. I think we have to do things like build social cohesion, social solidarity. If you look at what the Scandinavian countries, where they've really emphasized that over a period of decades, just building social cohesion, those countries are at the world's forefront in terms of generosity, you know, to countries in the global south. So put that in tangible terms. You know, Canada's Prime Minister Lester Pearson back in the 1960s had this idea that wealthy countries should allocate 0.7% of their GDP to official development assistance. You know, a great goal. Canada's never met that threshold. All of the Scandinavian countries consistently exceed it. So Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark are currently spending 4 times what Canada spends on official development assistance, aid to the world's poorest countries. Canadians actually perceive ourselves as being a much more generous country than we are. So I think there's a gap between the perception and the reality. And I think that, you know, we need really to think about, how do we overcome this? One thing I've always thought would be a terrific idea would be that high school students graduating in Canada should be encouraged to go to a year and financed to go for a year and do volunteer work in the global south in exchange for free tuition for when they come back home, get a free university degree. Because there's nothing we can do here in Canada to actually see the impacts of climate change, for example, in the global south. I mean, I'm very privileged in my role as the UN Special Rapporteur. I did a country mission to Fiji. It was life-changing to see the impacts of climate change in person on a small island developing state. I mean, I visited a community that had to be completely relocated because of climate change. I visited slums on the outskirts of Suva, the capital of Fiji, that were populated by people who had lost their homes in a tropical cyclone and were now living in extreme poverty and experiencing, you know, horrific living conditions, again, because of climate change. And so if you actually witness that human suffering in person, you can't possibly think that we can go on the way we are without being more generous, more open-hearted, more compassionate as human beings, as citizens. And I think that would really change the course of governance and public policy.
Sandeep, do you want to add anything about building public support and how we overcome resistance?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing, I mean, this is something I studied a little bit in my PhD. So one thing that for many countries, especially fossil fuel dependent countries, I think when we take climate action, there's going to be lots of people who will lose and lots of people who will gain, right? So if you think about the energy system, when you move away from fossil fuels, there's some provinces in every country or states who fear that, you know, their major industry will decline, and so that will lead to job losses and so on and so forth. And then obviously there are lots of gains from climate action that goes beyond, you know, helping the climate. You know, there'll be lots of jobs, there'll be other things, and so on, healthy environment, clean air, and so on and so forth. But this fear amongst in some countries, maybe a minority, that, you know, they will lose out, and that sort of is one of the motivations why some people at least are anti-climate, and that sentiment is fanned by politicians, obviously, certain types of politicians, certain categories of politicians. So that is one category of people who actually genuinely might lose something if you take bold climate action. And so we have to find a way to make sure there are policies and create just transition plans for those people and communities. Then there are other categories of people who genuinely don't know much about climate action or climate change, or it's too big a topic for them to think about. And I think for them, I think what David was suggesting, like, if they go and spend some time and understand how life is in some of these countries, that might really help. But also education, communication. Media is increasingly reporting climate change as climate crisis, which is really encouraging. I think from when I started thinking about climate change, which is 10, 12 years ago, to now, I think this is a completely different conversation. I think most people are aware, they have some stand, or if they are not aware, they at least know what it is. So they have some sense of fairness. I think we just have to push in that direction, but also make sure that we don't create more inequalities, more issues, economic dislocation, and reach out to those communities and people as we move forward. That would be my way of going forward in making sure there's more support for climate action.
So the next question we have comes from an SPPGA alumna who is Danae Bascom, who says, for any of the panelists, how can we create a sense of urgency in taking steps towards environmental justice? So during the COVID-19 public health crisis, we saw that there was a sense of urgency and actions were taken, of course, in some cases, I say as a sidebar, later, sometimes days or weeks later than the public might have hoped for or expected. But comparatively, Danae asked, it feels as if we essentially just watched fires across Australia and Canada displace communities, and there was only limited temporary and situational measures provided. So how do we create that sense of urgency that we saw during COVID in taking steps towards environmental justice? So Kelly, I don't know if you want to add anything about why you think there was such a sense of urgency with COVID, if there's any lessons from that.
Yeah, I mean, COVID-19 came upon us very, very quickly. It certainly was a quick crisis. I see climate change as a slow-moving disaster, and we tend to find that more difficult to respond to. And in public health, we have this area around non-communicable diseases or chronic diseases, and that's a slow-moving pandemic, with cancers and diabetes and so on. We're also struggling with trying to figure out what to do about that looming and very large, it's probably going to kill a lot more people than COVID-19. But we tend to, public policy is very reactive. We're very short term in our way of dealing with public health or public issues, because of the electoral cycle and so on. And that's something I think we need to address. There's one of the big problems is we have these 4 or 5 year cycles with government. They only seem to care about those timeframes, whereas we need to look at this in a much longer time frame. And I think that's why climate change tends to fall through the cracks.
Yeah, David and Sandeep, do you want to add anything else there? How do we create this sense of urgency that we need, and what can we learn from the urgency that was created by COVID?
Well, I mean, I think that, as Sandeep alluded to in his previous answer, people are now talking about it as a climate crisis, as a climate emergency. And I think that's a really important linguistic change that does heighten the urgency. So, continue to repeat that message is going to be critical going forward. And, environmental justice more broadly, it's the same kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of, as Professor Lee was just saying, I mean, more people died last year from air pollution than COVID, but there was, probably 10,000 times as much media attention on COVID. And yet those 7 million people a year are dying year in, year out. So, it's part of it is just figuring out ways. And this is not my field of expertise, but I think communication is a really important part of this. These ongoing problems, we get this something called issue fatigue, and we don't deal with it. And it's deeply frustrating.
David, you're just saying that to flatter me because I'm the moderator and I work on communications.
No, I really believe it's important.
Even with COVID, this is true. I say as a sidebar, right? That, yesterday, the number of people who died in the US from COVID was the same as March 1st, which was before vaccines became widely available. And this gives, this gives a sense of a huge ongoing crisis. And this is not the wall-to-wall coverage that we saw before. So even with something that still seems as immediately urgent as COVID, you can see issue fatigue over time and an acceptance of a level of death that would have been totally incomprehensible in March of 2020. And I think the comparison to air pollution is a similar one.
Yeah, but one thing that is super encouraging, and we haven't talked about this yet, is that at least in the climate change space and environmental justice as well, young people actually get this. So, you know, the Fridays for the Future movement, which was kind of derailed to some extent by the COVID pandemic, that was incredibly powerful, and it hasn't gone away. It's a sleeping dragon, I would say. And young people, I mean, I mentioned earlier the proposed legislation in Costa Rica to ban permanently oil and gas exploration and development. That's a really big political issue in Costa Rica. Public opinion poll last week found 50% of people in favor of that ban, 44% against. But when you asked people under the age of 35, 92% of them supported it. So, you know, it's just like we're on the cusp, I believe, of this transformation. Once these young people start coming into power, then I do think the world will change. So, you know, I tend to be optimistic about our long-term potential.
All right, next question. So the Uber moderator of this panel, Veena Sriram, has a question. So she writes, it appears that even if governments know what needs to be done, they are sometimes not able to overcome national and local political obstacles to putting those needed policies in place. And this, of course, applies to both COVID and the environment. So how do we address this issue of needing to satisfy these domestic and local policy challenges while also working towards global solidarity? So Sandeep, maybe I'll go to you first, seeing as I didn't let you respond to the last question.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the heart of the issue, right? Like, I think most governments around the world, at least in the climate space, know that they have to take action. And the delay is a result of A, vested interest in some contexts, and B, you know, they have to reconcile with local politics, local issues of relocation and, you know, dislocation, and like, how do you manage, because these fossil fuel systems, and I'm just focusing on fossil fuels. I mean, you know, climate crisis is way beyond just fossil fuels. But if you just think about the fossil fuels, these are large systems that are deeply embedded for decades in many countries, electricity system, way of life, and so on. And so because of this election cycle, I think, you know, many governments want to take sort of like only a few steps, but not that transformative change that they should ideally take. And for some, I mean, again, like re-emphasizing my point. So this argument that I made about, like, you know, this election cycle, and, you know, you have to reconcile with different provincial and state interests and community interests, is very much applicable in many rich countries. But I genuinely think that for some of the emerging economies, it's also a question of, can I develop using renewable energy, for example? Like, it's one thing to say, you know, the costs are, I don't want to go too technical into this, but like, it's one thing to say that renewable can power, but it's a completely different thing when you're actually trying to grow, and you don't really have many examples of big economies around the world who have used renewable energy technology. So for an emerging economy, it's also a question of energy security and so on, and various other questions that kind of stops them from taking that transformative step. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to this.
Yeah, thank you, David, and then we'll go to Kelly to give us perspective from the COVID world. David.
Yeah, just one quick thing that, you know, one of the biggest obstacles to effective climate policy is the vested interests who are, you know, wedded to today's system. You know, Professor Lee alluded to political economy earlier, and she also talked about our successful campaigns to reduce smoking. And one of the elements of that successful smoking model has been, you know, the World Health Organization Treaty on Tobacco Control, which required states to prevent tobacco companies from influencing public policy on health and smoking. And I really think we need to learn from that lesson and apply it in the climate context, because these big oil, gas, coal companies, big agriculture, they are one of the major blocks to governments doing what is needed. And we need to take them out of the equation and just say, you know, the same thing we said to tobacco companies. We're not interested in listening to your misinformation, disinformation on climate and energy anymore. And we're just going to move ahead without you in the room.
Kelly, anything you want to add from the COVID perspective about how do we move forward on this while dealing with domestic and local political challenges?
Yeah, well, it's really difficult, for sure. And it seems like we have this disconnect between these global emergencies and then what we have, to deal with them politically, our institutions. So we have this international state system, which was created in 1648 and reimagined in 1946 or 1945 after the Second World War. And we still have basically those institutions to work with. And here we are in the 21st century, globalization, global challenges, and we still have these kind of state-based systems, and it's slowing us completely down. And of course, within states, we also have a need for, I guess, and I'm not saying we should be anti-democratic, but we do have systems that require us to juggle, many different interests. And I think the problem there is that when you need decisive action, when you have emergencies in front of you, you need strong leadership, and we need the scope to do that. So when the Titanic was sinking, people didn't sort of like, let's take a poll and survey and see what people want to do. The ship is sinking. And so we need to be able to have these ability for our leadership to act in ways that will save the ship. And this is what we're missing at the moment, this disconnect. So I think maybe just continuing to emphasize that this collective global fate that we're facing is real. We don't need to look further, than here in BC with half the province was on fire, and we were, having this ongoing pandemic. We've seen it, we're staring it in the face, our challenges. So, maybe, hopefully that will be enough just to show people that really we have hit a real point of action.
So I'm going to make one sorry, David.
Perfect example of that disconnect was, a year and a half ago when the government of Canada one day announced a climate emergency, the very next day bought a pipeline. I mean, it was just, mind-boggling.
So I'm going to give one comment, and then we're going to move to the final question. When, I'm a natural optimist, continually challenged by the reality of the world we live in. So we are going to try and end on a positive, optimistic note. But I will say, one of the things that I did see through looking at COVID was that there were a few countries that learned from poor performance in the past to create very different types of systems that could be much more reactive. And, New Zealand was one that learned from the 1918-19 flu pandemic. If you look in their pandemic preparedness plan, they explicitly thanked the historian who wrote the history of the 1918-19 flu pandemic in New Zealand. So you can learn from a history that's 100 years ago, or you can be Taiwan and South Korea, and you can learn from SARS and MERS, which did not go well in either of those countries. And you can put in place systems that perform really pretty well compared to almost everywhere else in the rest of the world. So I think there are some of these examples. And that leads me to my final question to all three of you. And apologies to anybody whose questions we didn't get to answer, but here's my final question for you. So everyone has changed their minds about something or been genuinely dramatically surprised by some event or some policy that happened in the last 18 months, all of us. So, some of those might have been negative surprises, but as I said, I'm the natural optimist challenged by reality. So I'm going to ask you, what is one positive surprise? Something that was a positive surprise for you over the last 18 months? And what are some policy lessons we can learn from that? So we're going to flip the order from the first question we asked, going to go to David, Sandeep, and then Kelly. So David, a positive surprise and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, I think a positive surprise for me has been the emergence of women in positions of leadership at the helm of countries that have been actually handling both of these crises relatively effectively. So New Zealand, you just mentioned New Zealand and Taiwan, but also Denmark, Germany, Finland, and others. And so I think that's a powerful positive lesson that I don't know what the reason is. Maybe these women leaders have more compassion, more empathy, more intelligence. I don't know, but they seem to be doing a better job. And in my role at the UN, I work with amazing women leaders. The UN's human rights chief is Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. The head of UN Environment is Inger Anderson. The president of the UN Human Rights Council is Nazhat Khan from Fiji, who was that country's first judge. All of these women are brilliant, inspiring, passionate leaders. And so I think that's a really positive development that we need to cherish. And we need to, just look at this federal election campaign in Canada. Man, we could use some strong women leaders to run this country. It's embarrassing that we've never elected a woman as prime minister. And we should.
Sandeep, on to you. Won't happen this time, but maybe next time. Sandeep, on to you.
I think one of the big lessons in my lifetime, at least, I mean, there may be other things, but as far as I remember, like, I've never seen governments take such rapid action on anything. So that, I think, gives me a lot of hope that if they see enough incentives, if they see that the masses are requiring that kind of, sort of action, they can take, strong action. I mean, we know that they took such actions during wars, but this was sort of to solve the pandemic. I'm not saying those actions were perfect, but just the fact that they could mobilize so quickly and, mobilize at scale is something really positive, and that really gives me hope that we can, we can solve some of these bigger issues.
Thank you. Kelly, last but not least.
Yeah, first I thought, okay, that decoupling of the pandemic response, the effectiveness of the pandemic response and level of wealth, I thought that was surprised a lot of us who study global health security, and countries like Canada can learn from countries like Tanzania and Vietnam and Rwanda. So I quite like that idea. But I think I'd be the same with Sandeep. I would say that what surprised me most was that we didn't expect a vaccine, let alone 4 or 5 available in such a short time. And it really shows how, when we put our minds to it, we can, do these amazing things collectively. And those vaccines weren't just, one person sitting in a lab. These are collective efforts all around. They were public and private cooperation, and it was about, sharing data through WHO. There were solidarity trials and vaccine development studies. It just showed how we can potentially do this if we wanted to. So I think that achievement is nothing short of a Nobel Prize level achievement, and I'm sure that will come. But I think it also tells us that, we can do remarkable things, but we also need to make sure that we do something with those remarkable things and do even the bigger thing, which is to share them with the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. Those are 3 wonderful, positive things to leave us with, but they also leave all of us here with some action items that we too should be thinking about. So David, Kelly, Sandeep, thank you so much. And now back to Veena for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to that was such a phenomenal panel, and just learned so much in this time we've had together. So thank you to our panelists, Kelly Lee, David Boyd, and Sandeep Pai, for sharing your expertise and insights, to the students and attendees who shared such incisive questions, really fantastic. And last but not least, to Heidi Tworek for your creative questions and your fantastic moderation. Thank you so much. There were so many important insights today. I'll just name a couple. I thought that discussion on the intersection between human rights and environmental law or global health law was really interesting. The politics of mandatory measures versus voluntary approaches, questions of equity, whether the privileged will actually give up power. And I think finally, what will it take for governments to step up and accelerate their actions in these and other areas of policy? And I think the comments all of you made to end the panel were really interesting, and a lot for us to take back with us. I also want to say thank you to Elder Larry Grant and to Ramana for their remarks. And a special thanks to all of you who've attended and engaged with us with such great insights and questions. Enjoy your weekend, stay warm, stay dry, and we look forward to having you at future SPPGA events. Thank you.